Good evening, dear listener. Welcome to this quiet corner of mystery, where the world slows down and gentle puzzles unfold like petals in the evening light. Make yourself comfortable. Perhaps imagine a soft blanket across your lap, a warm cup of tea cradled in your hands, the steam rising in lazy curls. Let your shoulders ease, your breathing deepen. Tonight, join Miss Marple in a soothing tale of observation and understanding. If these calm mysteries bring you peace, do consider subscribing for more gentle stories to ease you toward restful sleep. And now, let us begin. In the hush of a late autumn afternoon, the little train station at St. Mary Mead stood just as it always had, timeless, unhurried, bathed in pale golden light. A porter swept the platform in slow, steady strokes. A single bench waited beneath the old clock. And there, near the ticket window, something very ordinary appeared to happen. A gentleman simply fell. Yet to Miss Jane Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting on the far end of the platform, that ordinary moment carried the faintest breath of something not quite right, something that whispered, "Perhaps this is not what it seems." Chapter 1: The Quiet Beginning. Miss Jane Marple had never been one for grand adventures or distant travels. She preferred the small, familiar rhythms of village life, the way the light changed on the church spire through the seasons, the sound of the milk cart coming up the lane at dawn, the gentle clatter of teacups in the drawing room after morning service. Yet on certain afternoons, when the house felt a little too still and the garden had been tended to perfection, she allowed herself a small treat. She walked the short distance to St. Mary Mead station, settled herself on the far end of the platform bench with her knitting bag, and simply watched the world go by. It was a harmless occupation, she always told herself, and one that suited her perfectly. People revealed so much when they believed no one was truly paying attention. A hurried step, a glance at a watch, the way a hand adjusted a scarf against the wind. These were the tiny brushstrokes that painted the portrait of a life. And so, on this particular late October afternoon, with the sky the color of weak tea and the air carrying the faint, sweet smoke of bonfires from distant gardens, Miss Marple made her way along the lane, her sensible shoes making soft sounds on the gravel. She wore her second-best tweed coat, the one with the small herringbone pattern that had once belonged to her sister, and a warm woolen scarf in soft heather shades. In her bag, she carried the half-finished pair of bed socks she was knitting for old Mrs. Bantry, who always complained her feet were cold even in summer, together with a small packet of barley sugar in case the afternoon grew long. The station was only 10 minutes' walk from her cottage, and she arrived with plenty of time before the 3:47 to Market Basing. The platform was almost deserted, as it usually was at this hour. Old Mr. Entwistle had already collected his newspaper from the kiosk and gone home to his tea. Mrs. Price, with her eternal string bag, had caught the earlier train to visit her sister in Limstock. The porter, young Tom Wilkins, was sweeping the far end of the platform with long, deliberate strokes, humming something tuneless under his breath. The signal arm stood straight and red against the pale sky, waiting. Miss Marple chose her usual place, the bench nearest the waiting room door, but not so close as to seem intrusive. She arranged her bag beside her, opened her knitting pattern, and began to click the needles in a slow, soothing rhythm. Click, click, click. The sound blended with the rustle of dry leaves skittering along the platform edge and the distant clank of shunting goods wagons somewhere down the line. She had been sitting perhaps 10 minutes when she noticed him. Mr. Reginald Hale came walking along the platform from the direction of the village. He was not a native of Saint. A merry Mead, he had taken the little house by the old mill only the previous spring. But already he had become one of those quiet figures everyone knew by sight and nodded to politely. Tall, thin, silver-haired, always correctly dressed in a dark overcoat and a soft felt hat. He carried a modest brown suitcase of the kind one might take for a single night away. Nothing ostentatious. His step was measured, not hurried, yet there was something careful about it, as though he were counting each pace. He passed the bench where Miss Marple sat. Their eyes met for a moment. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, lifting his hat a fraction. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hale." She smiled her small, gentle smile. "Off to town, are you?" "Just for the day," he replied. His voice was quiet, cultured, yet with the faintest trace of a northern accent that had been smoothed away by years elsewhere. "A few small errands. I shall be back by the evening train." "That's sensible," she said comfortably. "The evenings are drawing in so quickly now. One doesn't like to be caught out after dark." "Quite so." He gave a small nod, replaced his hat, and continued towards the ticket window. Miss Marple watched him go. She noticed the way he set the suitcase down carefully while he purchased his ticket, the way he checked his watch twice in quick succession, although the big station clock was plainly visible above the platform. She noticed, too, that he bought a return ticket, third class, single day, rather than a single, a small detail, but one that pleased her sense of order. People who planned properly always bought returns when they meant to come back. Or when he had his ticket, he walked to the edge of the platform and stood looking down the line toward the distant cutting where the train would first appear. The wind lifted the edge of his coat. He buttoned it more tightly across his chest. Then he turned just once and glanced back, not toward Miss Marple, but toward the ticket office, toward the lane that led into the village. The look lasted only a second or two, but it was long enough for her to see something pass across his face. Not fear, exactly, not sadness. Something quieter. Resignation, perhaps, or relief. She lowered her eyes to her knitting. The sock was growing nicely. Another inch or so, and she could begin the heel. Click, click, click. Presently, the distant whistle sounded. Two short, one long. The signal arm dropped with a clack. Tom Wilkins set his broom aside and walked towards the gate to open it for any alighting passengers. A minute later, the 347 rounded the bend, steam curling upward in the cool air, wheels slowing with that soft metallic sigh that always sounded to Miss Marple like a long-held breath being released. Doors opened. Two passengers stepped down, a young woman with a child in tow, and an elderly man carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper. A handful of people boarded. Mr. Harrow, the solicitor's clerk, Mrs. Beddoes with her market basket, and Mr. Hale. He moved toward the rear carriage, suitcase in hand. He paused at the door, set the case down again on the platform for a moment, while he reached for the handle. His hand trembled, just once, very slightly. Then he steadied himself, lifted the case, and stepped up into the carriage. But before he disappeared inside, he turned once more. He looked back along the platform, past the ticket window, past the bench where Miss Marple sat, all the way to the lane and the village beyond. For the briefest instant, his eyes seemed to rest on nothing in particular, yet everything at once. Then he entered the carriage. The door closed. The guard blew his whistle. The train gave a gentle jerk and began to move, gathering speed slowly, smoke drifting across the platform like grey muslin. Miss Marple continued knitting. The sock grew. The platform emptied. Tom Wilkins returned to his sweeping. But she had noticed one last thing. Mr. Hale's suitcase. No, wait. He had taken the suitcase into the carriage with him. Hadn't he? No, he had not. When he had paused at the carriage door, he had lifted only himself inside, and the brown suitcase remained exactly where he had set it, on the platform bench nearest the rear carriage, forgotten. Tom Wilkins would find it soon enough, no doubt. He would carry it inside the office and wait for someone to claim it. But Miss Marple, watching the last wisps of steam disappear around the bend, felt the faintest prickle of curiosity stir beneath her calm. Why would a man who was only going to market basing for the day, who had said quite plainly he would return by the evening train, leave his suitcase behind? She tucked the knitting back into her bag, folded her hands in her lap, and sat for a few minutes longer in the quiet that followed the train's departure. The clock above the platform ticked steadily on. Somewhere, a blackbird called from the hedge. The afternoon light slanted lower, turning the iron rails to gold. Aunt and Miss Marple, in her gentle, unhurried way, began to wonder. Chapter 2. Something slightly unusual. The train had scarcely rounded the first bend and vanished behind the line of poplars when the platform seemed to settle back into its familiar quiet. The steam drifted away like a sigh, leaving only the faint smell of coal and warm iron in the air. Miss Marple remained seated for a few moments longer, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her gaze resting on the small brown suitcase that still sat exactly where Mr. Hale had left it, on the wooden bench nearest the spot where the rear carriage door had been. It was not an especially remarkable suitcase. Leather corners slightly scuffed, brass catches polished but not new, a modest label pasted on one side bearing the initials Rage in neat black ink. Yet there it rested, abandoned, sits as though its owner had simply forgotten it existed the moment he stepped aboard. Miss Marple tilted her head a fraction, considering. Tom Wilkins, the porter, finished his sweeping and noticed the case almost at once. He walked over with the easy stride of a man who had dealt with forgotten umbrellas, parcels, and once even a small terrier that had been left tied to a lamp-post. He lifted the suitcase, tested its weight, frowned slightly, then carried it toward the ticket office without a second glance at Miss Marple. She rose slowly, smoothing her coat, and followed at a gentle distance. The afternoon light was already beginning to slant, turning the gravel to soft amber. Inside the little office, Tom set the case on the counter beside the ticket ledger. Left behind this was, he said to the ticket clerk, Mr. Phipps, in who was counting change with the same careful slowness he applied to everything. Gentleman in the dark coat, Mr. Hale, I think, took the 347. Mr. Phipps peered over his spectacles. Return ticket he bought. Said he'd be back by the 6:15. Odd to leave his bag then, isn't it? Tom remarked, more to himself than to anyone else. He gave the case a small shake. It made almost no sound, no rattle of keys, no rustle of clothing. Feels light? Very light. Miss Marple had paused just inside the doorway, pretending to adjust the scarf at her throat while she listened. She did not enter fully. There was no need to intrude. People spoke more freely when they believed the conversation was private. Perhaps he'll telephone from market basing when he realizes, Mr. Phipps suggested. Or maybe it's only a change of shirt and a razor. Because some gentlemen travel light. Tom shrugged and placed the suitcase on a shelf behind the counter, out of the way but visible. I'll keep an eye. If no one claims it by closing, I'll take it round to his house by the mill. Poor gentleman looked a bit peaky today, did you notice? Miss Marple turned away before they could see her. She walked back along the platform, past the bench where she had sat, past the spot where Mr. Hale had paused at the carriage door. She stopped there for a moment and looked down at the ground. Nothing unusual. No drop ticket, no handkerchief, no small personal item. Only the clean sweep of Tom's broom and the faint imprint where the suitcase had rested. Yet the tremor in Mr. Hale's hand returned to her mind. It had been so brief, so quickly controlled, that most people would have missed it entirely. In that second glance, back along the platform, not hurried, not anxious, but deliberate, as though he were saying goodbye to something more than just the village. She began the walk home along the lane. The hedgerows were turning russet and gold. A few late blackberries still clung to the briars. A bicycle passed her, young Jimmy from the post office, whistling, and she nodded pleasantly. But her thoughts remained at the station. By the time she reached her own gate, the sky had deepened to the color of old rose. She let herself in, hung her coat, and went straight to the small sitting room where the fire had been laid ready by faithful Cherry earlier in the day. She lit it with a single match, watched the kindling catch, then sat in her usual chair and took up the knitting again. Click, click, click. She reviewed the afternoon in her mind, as though turning the pages of a familiar book, looking for the place where the type had smudged ever so slightly. Mr. Hale had arrived on time. He had spoken politely. He had bought a return ticket. He had carried a suitcase. He had boarded the train. The suitcase had remained behind. Each fact was ordinary in itself. Together, they formed a small pattern that did not quite fit. A man who intended to return the same evening did not usually leave his luggage on the platform. A man who was only going to Market Basing for a few small errands did not need a suitcase at all, unless the errands were of a kind that required a change of clothes, or papers, or something he did not wish to carry openly in a briefcase, or unless he did not intend to return at all. Miss Marple paused in her knitting, and the thought had come so quietly that it hardly startled her. She considered it calmly, the way one considers whether the milk has gone off or the roses need deadheading. She remembered something else then, something she had seen only in passing as the train pulled away. When Mr. Hale had turned for that last look along the platform, his eyes had not been focused on any person or building. They had rested, just for a heartbeat, on the old signal box at the far end of the platform, the one that had not been used since the new automatic signals were installed 3 summers ago. The box stood empty now, its windows dusty, its door padlocked. Yet Mr. Hale had looked at it as though it meant something to him. She had no idea why. But the detail lodged itself in her memory beside the forgotten suitcase. The trembling hand, and the quiet relief on his face. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the first stars appeared above the garden wall. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. The sock was nearly ready for the heel flap. She would finish it tonight, she decided, and perhaps walk over to Mrs. Bantry's tomorrow with a small pot of quince jelly as well. Life went on in its usual way. Yet somewhere beneath the surface of that ordinary way, a small thread had begun to pull. The next morning, the village post brought the usual mixture: a circular from the drapers, a bill for the coal, a postcard from her nephew Raymond showing the dome of St. Peter's in Rome, and then, tucked among them, a brief paragraph in the local weekly paper that had been delivered early. Sudden death at Market Basing Station. It was only 3 lines. Mr. Reginald Hale, lately resident in St. Mary Mead, was found collapsed on the platform of Market Basing Station yesterday afternoon, shortly after arrival on the 3:47 train from the village. A doctor was called, but life was pronounced extinct. The cause appears to have been natural. Mr. Hale had no known relatives in the district. Miss Marple read the notice twice, then folded the paper neatly and placed it on the small table beside her breakfast cup. Natural causes. Collapsed on the platform shortly after arrival. She poured herself a second cup of tea, added a little milk, and stirred slowly. The suitcase, she thought, still sitting on the shelf in the ticket office, no doubt, unless Tom Wilkins had already carried it round to the house by the mill. She finished her breakfast without haste, cleared the table, washed the china, and put on her second-best coat once more. Now it was time, she decided, to take a small walk past the station again. The morning was fresh, the air smelling of dew and wood smoke. As she passed the mill, she saw that the curtains at Mr. Hale's windows were still drawn. No smoke rose from the chimney. The gate stood latched as usual. At the station, Tom Wilkins was sweeping again, this time the approach road. He touched his cap when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Marple. Sad business about Mr. Hale, isn't it?" "Very sad," she agreed gently. "I suppose the suitcase is still here." "Still here," Tom confirmed. "Police took a look yesterday evening. Nothing much inside, they said. Just an old coat and a few papers. They said to leave it for now. Solicitors coming down from Market Basing tomorrow to see about the house and that." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite right. One must be orderly." She did not ask to see the suitcase. There was no need. Not yet. Instead, she walked to the far end of the platform, to the place where Mr. Hale had stood, waiting for the train. She looked again toward the old signal box. The padlock was still in place. The windows were still dusty. But now, in the clearer morning light, she noticed something she had missed the day before. On the ground beneath the single window of the signal box lay a small, pale object. A piece of paper, perhaps, or a card. It had caught on a tuft of grass and was trembling slightly in the breeze. Miss Marple glanced around. No one was watching. She stepped off the platform edge, crossed the short stretch of gravel, and bent carefully to pick it up. It was a single ticket stub, 3rd class, Market Basing to St. Mary Mead. Yesterday's date, a return half. Miss Marple held it between her fingers for a long moment. Then she slipped it quietly into her handbag, returned to the platform, and continued her walk home. The pattern, she thought, was beginning to show just a little more clearly. Chapter 3. Gentle Observations. The morning after the newspaper notice appeared, Miss Marple did not hurry. She never hurried. Instead, she spent the first part of the day in her usual quiet routine: a light breakfast of toast and marmalade, a short inspection of the garden to see which roses still held against the coming frost, a few minutes spent tying back the late clematis that had begun to trail across the path. Only when the clock in the hall chimed 10:30 did she put on her hat, the small felt one with the velvet ribbon, and set off once more toward the village. She walked slowly, greeting those she met with the same gentle nod and small pleasantries that had been her habit for decades. Old Mrs. Sims carrying a basket of laundry, the butcher's boy on his bicycle, Dr. Haydock, who raised his hat and inquired politely after her health. To each she replied in kind, yet beneath the surface of these ordinary exchanges, her mind moved steadily, turning over the small fragments she had gathered. The ticket stub from beneath the signal box now rested safely in the inner pocket of her handbag. She had examined it again by daylight. Quite ordinary. Third-class return half. Date stamped the previous afternoon at Market Basing. The perforations were clean. It had been torn from a ticket that had once been whole. Mr. Hale had bought a return at St. Mary Mead. Used the outward half to board the train, and somehow, without ever leaving the carriage at Market Basing, the return half had found its way back to the old signal box in his home village. That small impossibility interested her more than the death itself. She reached the high street and turned toward the post office. Inside, young Jimmy was sorting letters behind the counter. He looked up with his usual bright smile. "Morning, Miss Marple. Parcel for you. Came on the morning van." "Thank you, Jimmy." She accepted the small brown paper package, wool samples from the supplier in Winchester, and lingered a moment by the counter, pretending to study the display of birthday cards. "I suppose you've heard about poor Mr. Hale." Jimmy nodded solemnly. "Terrible shame, isn't it? Collapsed right on the platform, they say. Heart, most likely. He always seemed a bit quiet, didn't he?" "Very quiet," Miss Marple agreed. "Did he come in here often?" "Now and then. Bought his stamps, posted the odd letter. Always polite. Never said much beyond good morning and thank you." Miss Marple opened her purse and took out a penny for a postcard she did not particularly need. "I wonder, did he ever post anything unusual? A large envelope, perhaps, or something registered?" Jimmy thought for a moment, scratching the back of his neck. "Not that I recall. Just ordinary letters. One time he posted a small packet, about so big. He measured with his hands. But it was months ago. Addressed to some firm in London, I think. Looked like papers." "Thank you, Jimmy." "That's very kind." She left the post office and continued along the street, past the baker's, where the smell of fresh loaves drifted out, past the greengrocer's, with its neat pyramids of apples. At the corner she paused, looking down the lane that led toward the mill and Mr. Hale's house. The curtains were still drawn. A faint film of dew lay on the gate latch, undisturbed. She did not go closer. There would be time for that later, when the solicitor arrived. For now she turned instead toward the churchyard path, a longer route home, but one that allowed her to pass the station once more without appearing to do so deliberately. The platform was busier than the previous afternoon. The 11:22 to Market Basing had just departed. Several people were walking away toward the village. Mrs. Beddoes with her shopping, two schoolboys kicking a stone between them, the station master himself checking the signals with his lantern. Tom Wilkins was there too, polishing the brass plate beside the ticket window. Miss Marple approached slowly. "Good morning again, Tom." "Morning, miss." He straightened up, touching his cap. "Back so soon?" "I took a longer walk today. The air is so fresh after rain." She glanced toward the shelf inside the office. "The suitcase is still here, I see." "Aye. Solicitor's man isn't due till tomorrow. Police said nothing much in it anyway. Just an old coat, a timetable, and a bit of paper with some writing." "Did they read it aloud?" she asked mildly. Tom hesitated, then lowered his voice. Not exactly, but I caught a glimpse when they opened it. Looked like a note, short, neat handwriting. Something about the train must leave on time. Odd thing to write, I thought. Miss Marple's expression remained perfectly calm. People do write curious things when they're in a hurry, don't they? Perhaps it was a reminder to himself. Could be, Tom agreed, though he sounded unconvinced. She thanked him and walked to the far end of the platform again. The old signal box stood silent, its paint peeling in long curls. She looked once more at the ground beneath the window. No more ticket stubs, no scraps of paper, only the short grass and a few scattered pebbles. Yet she noticed something else now, something she had overlooked in the morning light. A small mark on the wooden door frame of the signal box, about 4 feet from the ground. Not a scratch exactly, but a faint smudge, as though something soft had brushed against the wood and left the slightest trace of dust or chalk. She stepped closer and peered. The mark was roughly circular, on the size of a penny or perhaps a button. It had no particular shape, yet it was recent. The dust around it had been disturbed. She did not touch it. Instead, she stepped back and looked up at the window. The glass was grimy, but through the dirt, she could just make out the outline of the interior. An old lever frame, a stool, a shelf with a few forgotten oil cans. Nothing moved inside. Miss Marple returned to the platform bench where she had sat the day before. She opened her knitting bag, took out the nearly finished sock, and began to work on the heel flap. The needles moved steadily. Click, click, click. As she knitted, she watched the people who passed. Mrs. Price came hurrying back from the shops, string bag swinging. She always walked with short, determined steps, head down, as though the world owed her speed. Today she paused at the ticket window to ask about the afternoon train times, then hurried on without a glance at the old signal box. Mr. Harrow, the solicitor's clerk, appeared next, briefcase under his arm. He walked more slowly, stopping to light a cigarette. He stood for a full minute, gazing down the line, smoke curling upward, before continuing towards the village. His eyes, Miss Marple noted, did not once turn toward the signal box. A stranger, an older man in a checked overcoat, arrived on foot from the direction of the mill. He bought a ticket to Market Basing, waited near the edge of the platform, and boarded the next local train without speaking to anyone. His suitcase was heavy. He carried it with both hands. And then there was young Elsie from the draper's shop. She came cycling past, basket full of parcels, and waved cheerfully to Tom. She did not stop, but as she passed the signal box, her bicycle wobbled slightly. She corrected it at once, and Miss Marple thought she saw the girl glance quickly toward the dusty window before pedaling on. Small things. Tiny glances, tiny hesitations. None of them conclusive. Yet each added a thread to the pattern. By early afternoon, Miss Marple had finished the heel and begun the foot of the sock. She packed her knitting away, rose, and started the walk home. On the lane, she met Dr. Haydock again. He was returning from a call, his bag swinging at his side. Miss Marple, out enjoying the air? Very much so, Doctor. Though I'm afraid the news about Mr. Hale has rather cast a shadow. Haydock's expression sobered. Yes, I was called to Market Basing yesterday. Pure formality, of course, and the station master had already sent for the local man. But I happened to be in town. Nothing suspicious. Hart gave out quite suddenly. He'd been sitting in the carriage, apparently dozed off, and when the porter helped him down, he simply didn't wake up. Peaceful then, Miss Marple murmured. Very peaceful. No pain, no struggle. The sort of end many of us might wish for, if we're honest. She nodded slowly. Did he have anything with him? On his person, I mean. Only the usual. Watch, wallet, keys, a return ticket stub in his coat pocket. Odd, that, since he never used it. But people keep things in pockets for years sometimes. Indeed they do. Haydock touched his hat and continued on his way. Miss Marple stood a moment longer in the lane, watching him disappear around the bend. A return ticket stub in his pocket. Another return half beneath the signal box. Two halves of the same ticket. One used to leave, the other somehow returned. She resumed walking, her step as gentle as ever. By tea time, she was back in her sitting room, the fire burning low, the sock laid neatly on the arm of her chair. She poured tea from the small silver pot, added milk, and sat looking into the flames. The pattern was clearer now, not complete, but clearer. Mr. Hale had died at Market Basing Station. Yet something essential, had happened here, at St. Mary Mead, before the train even left. She lifted her cup and sipped slowly. Tomorrow the solicitor would arrive. Tomorrow, perhaps, the suitcase would be opened again in official company. Until then, she would wait and watch. Chapter 4. A Calm Contradiction. The solicitor arrived the following afternoon on the 2:18 from Market Basing. Miss Marple knew the time because she had consulted the timetable pinned to the kitchen wall after breakfast. She did not go to meet him at the station. That would have seemed too eager. Instead, she waited at home, tending to a tray of seed cake she had baked that morning and setting out the best china on the small table by the window. One never knew when a visitor might call, and it was always wise to be prepared. The knock came shortly after 4 o'clock. Cherry answered the door and showed the gentleman in, a Mr. Lionel Enderby, tall, slightly stooped, with the careful manner of someone accustomed to handling delicate matters. He carried a slim leather briefcase and wore a dark suit that had seen many quiet funerals. Miss Marple? He inquired, removing his hat. I hope I do not intrude. I am the late Mr. Hale's solicitor. I understand from the village postmistress that you were acquainted with him. Only slightly, Miss Marple replied, offering her hand with a small smile. But I should be very glad if you would take a cup of tea. The kettle has just boiled. Mr. Enderby hesitated only a moment before accepting. They sat in the sitting room, the fire burning low and steady, the late afternoon light falling in soft bars across the carpet. I came to settle the few affairs Mr. Hale left behind, he explained after the first sip. There is no family, you see, no wife, no children, a few distant cousins in the north, but they have already indicated they wish nothing to do with the estate. The house by the mill is rented. The furniture will be sold. The police have released the contents of the suitcase found at the station. I collected it this morning. Miss Marple nodded gently. I heard it was quite light. Surprisingly so, Mr. Enderby agreed. He opened his briefcase and drew out a folded sheet of paper. The police made an inventory: coat, pocket handkerchief, small pocket Bible, railway timetable for the southern region, and this note. He passed the sheet across the table. Miss Marple took it carefully between thumb and forefinger. The handwriting was small, precise, and very neat. Forgive me. The train must leave on time. R.H. No date, no addressee. Just those 9 words. Miss Marple read them twice, then returned the paper. A curious message, she murmured. Indeed. The coroner saw it, but attached no particular importance. He concluded natural causes. cardiac failure, accelerated perhaps by some private distress. Mr. Hale had consulted a heart specialist in London 2 years ago. The report is in my file. Miss Marple poured a second cup for her guest. And the ticket? I believe Dr. Haydock mentioned a return stub was found in his pocket. Yes, market basing to St. Mary Mead, unused. Mr. Enderby frowned slightly. Odd that. He bought a return in the village, used the outward portion, and kept the return half in his pocket, as though he meant to come back. Yet he never left the carriage at Market Basing in any conscious state. The porter who helped him down said he was already quite still, breathing shallowly, eyes closed. They thought he was asleep, until they realized he was not. Miss Marple set her cup down with the softest clink. So he travelled from here to there, already dying. Or already dead, Mr. Enderby corrected gently. The doctor at Market Basing estimated time of death between 4 and 4:30. The journey takes 35 minutes. He must have slipped away very shortly after departure. A small silence settled between them. Miss Marple looked toward the window. Outside, the light was fading. The first lamps were being lit along the lane. Yet the suitcase was left behind on the platform here, she said quietly, almost empty, as though he did not expect or did not wish to need it again. Mr. Enderby nodded. Precisely. And that note? The train must leave on time. It has a certain finality, does it not? It does. She rose and went to the small bureau by the wall. On from the top drawer, she took the return ticket stub she had found beneath the signal box and placed it on the table beside the note. Mr. Enderby stared at it. Where did you find this? On the ground near the old signal box at the station, yesterday morning. He picked it up, turned it over. This is the other half. The perforations match exactly. Yes. He looked at her with new attention. You have been observing this matter closely, Miss Marple. I happened to be on the platform when Mr. Hale left, she said simply. One notices things. Mr. Enderby replaced the stub beside the note. So we have a complete return ticket, split in two. One half used to leave St. Mary Mead. The other half returned here, somehow. Without Mr. Hale ever stepping off the train at the other end. Miss Marple resumed her seat. That is the contradiction, is it not? If he died in the carriage shortly after leaving here, if he never reached Market Basing in any living sense, how did the return half of his ticket come to be lying on the ground beneath the signal box in St. Mary Mead? Mr. Enderby rubbed his chin slowly. It might have fallen from his pocket as he boarded. The wind could have carried it. Possible, Miss Marple conceded. But the platform was swept clean that afternoon. Tom Wilkins is very thorough, and the stub was not on the platform itself. It was beneath the signal box window, tucked against the grass, almost as though placed there deliberately. By whom? That, said Miss Marple softly, is what puzzles me. They sat in silence for several minutes. The fire settled with a small sigh. Mr. Enderby spoke at last. You think there is more to this than a simple heart attack? I think, Miss Marple replied, that Mr. Hale chose his moment and his place with some care. He wished the death to appear to have happened elsewhere, far enough away that no one in the village would connect it immediately to anything private or painful here. Yet he left traces, small, quiet traces, that point back to St. Mary Mead. The suitcase, the note, the ticket, and perhaps something else, she added. something still waiting to be seen. Mr. Enderby gathered his papers. I shall be staying at the Blue Boar tonight. If anything further occurs to you, Miss Marple, I should be glad to hear it. The inquest is set for next week. A formality, the coroner says. But formalities can sometimes be adjusted by new information. Miss Marple walked him to the door, and the evening air was cool and smelled of wood smoke. Thank you for coming, Mr. Enderby, and for the tea. He smiled faintly. The tea was excellent, and the conversation illuminating. When he had gone, Miss Marple returned to the sitting room. She did not light the lamp at once. Instead, she stood by the window, looking out at the darkening lane. The contradiction lay plain before her now. Death at Market Basing Station, official, recorded, accepted. Yet every small detail, the light suitcase, the unused return half found here, the note's quiet insistence that the train must leave on time, pointed the other way. The real death, the chosen moment, had been here. At the train station, in St. Mary Mead, right under her eyes. She drew the curtains against the night, turned up the lamp, and took up her knitting once more, and the sock was nearly finished. Only the toe remained. She began to decrease the stitches, one by one, with slow, careful care. Tomorrow she would visit the old signal box again, in daylight, with permission perhaps from Tom Wilkins to look inside. The pattern was almost complete. Only a few more threads needed pulling. Chapter 5. A Detail Revisited. The following morning dawned clear and still, with frost rimming the edges of every leaf in Miss Marple's garden. She rose early, as was her habit, lit the fire in the sitting room, and prepared a simple breakfast of porridge and tea. While the kettle sang, she stood at the kitchen window, watching the thin mist rise from the lane and thinking once more of the ticket stub, the note, and the light suitcase that had never traveled. And after breakfast, she wrapped herself warmly, her everyday coat this time, the one with the deep pockets, and set out for the station. She carried no knitting today. Instead, she had in her bag a small notebook and pencil, together with the return ticket, half she had found beneath the signal box. She did not intend to take notes in public, but the act of carrying them gave her a quiet sense of purpose. The platform was almost empty when she arrived. The early goods train had passed through. The next passenger service was not due for another 40 minutes. Tom Wilkins was in the ticket office, polishing the brass bell that stood on the counter. He looked up as she entered. "Morning, Miss Marple. Cold one today." "Very bracing," she agreed. "I wondered if I might have a quiet word, Tom, about the old signal box." Tom set the cloth down. "The old box, not been used in years. Doors padlocked, company key only. Why do you ask?" "I noticed a small mark on the doorframe the other day," she said mildly. "A smudge, rather like chalk or dust. I thought perhaps someone had been near it recently. With your permission, I should like to look more closely. From the outside, of course." Tom considered this for a moment. He was a kind young man, fond of the village and its elderly residents. "Can't see any harm. I'll come with you. Got the key anyway. Station master leaves it with me for emergencies." They walked together along the platform to the far end. The signal box stood a little apart, raised on its small wooden platform, its single flight of steps weathered but sound. Tom fitted the key into the padlock, turned it with a soft click, and swung the door open just wide enough for them to peer inside. The interior smelled of dust and old oil. Sunlight slanted through the grimy windows, picking out motes that drifted lazily. The lever frame was still in place, its brass handles tarnished. A faded timetable hung on the wall, curling at the edges. On the narrow shelf beneath the window lay a few odds and ends: an empty tobacco tin, a broken pencil, a small square of folded paper that had once been white but was now yellowed. Miss Marple's eyes went at once to the paper. "May I?" she asked softly. Tom nodded. She lifted it carefully with the tips of 2 fingers. It was a single sheet, torn from a small notebook. The handwriting matched the note Mr. Enderby had shown her. Small, precise, very neat. "If you find this, please destroy it. I have taken the draft in the carriage. By market basing, I shall be gone. No one need know the why or the how. The train will carry me. Forgive the trouble." R. H. Miss Marple read the words slowly, then refolded the paper and placed it back exactly where it had lain. Tom had seen enough to look troubled. "That's his writing, isn't it? Same as the other note." "Yes," she said quietly. "It is." She stepped back onto the platform. Tom locked the door again without speaking. They stood for a moment in silence, the frost glittering on the rails. "He left it here deliberately," Miss Marple said at last. "Not on the platform, where it might be swept away or noticed at once. Inside the signal box, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one would look unless they had reason to." "But how did he get inside?" Tom asked. "Door was locked. Always is." Miss Marple looked up at the single window. It was latched from the inside, but the latch was old and loose. She pointed. A thin stick or a piece of wire through the crack could lift it. Or perhaps he had a duplicate key from years ago, when the box was still in use. He lived by the mill. He may have known the old signalman. Tom rubbed his chin. "Could be. Old Mr. Grayson retired 5 years back. Mr. Hale did come by sometimes. Brought him tobacco once or twice when he was poorly." Miss Marple nodded. The small detail fit neatly into place. They returned to the ticket office. Tom offered her a chair and a cup of tea from his thermos. She accepted gratefully. As they sat, the morning train whistle sounded in the distance. "The suitcase," she said, after a sip. "You said it was almost empty." "Near enough. Old coat, timetable, that note we already know about. Nothing heavy." "And the coat. Did you notice anything about it?" Tom frowned, thinking back. Bit dusty on the shoulders, like it had been laid down somewhere dirty for a while. And there was a faint smell, medicinal almost, like cough mixture, but sweeter. Miss Marple set her cup down. "Laudanum, perhaps, or morphine, something peaceful, something a man might keep for pain, or for a final sleep." Tom's eyes widened. "You mean he—" "I mean," she said gently, "that Mr. Hale did not collapse at market basing by chance. He arranged it so. He boarded the train here, already carrying what he needed in his pocket or in a small vial. He sat in the carriage, waited until the train was well underway, and then took his draft. By the time the train reached market basing, he was beyond help. The porter helped him off, thinking him merely drowsy. A few steps, and he lay down quietly on the platform. Natural causes. No fuss. No scandal." "But why leave the suitcase behind?" Tom asked. "To make it appear he meant to return. A man going away forever does not pack an empty case and leave it on the platform. A man planning a day trip might forget it in a moment of distraction or weakness. And the ticket halves? One half he used to board. The other he must have dropped, or arranged to have dropped, near the signal box before he left. Perhaps he posted it back to himself, in an envelope addressed to the station, knowing it would arrive the next day and be set aside until someone looked. Or perhaps he simply placed it there himself the evening before when no one was watching. Tom let out a long breath, and all that planning just to die quietly. Not quietly, Miss Marple corrected with the gentlest emphasis. Privately. There is a difference. She rose, smoothing her coat. Thank you, Tom. You've been most helpful. As she walked home along the lane, the frost began to melt under the strengthening sun. The mist lifted completely, revealing the soft blue of the sky. The detail she had revisited, the note in the signal box, had changed everything. It was not a contradiction anymore. It was confirmation. Mr. Hale had died at the train station, but not at Market Basing, at St. Mary Mead. Right here. The train had carried his body away, like a gentle messenger delivering the news elsewhere. Yet every clue he had left pointed back. The forgotten suitcase, the split ticket, the hidden note, yet the faint chalk mark on the door frame, where he had perhaps steadied himself one last time. Miss Marple reached her gate, let herself in, and hung her coat. In the sitting room, the fire had burned down to embers. She added a small log, watched it catch, then sat in her chair. The sock waited on the side table, its toe finished the night before. She picked it up, folded it neatly, and placed it in her work basket for Mrs. Bantry. The mystery was no longer scattered. It had drawn together into a single quiet shape. She understood now why the title had felt so strangely insistent from the very beginning. Death at the train station. Miss Marple witnesses crime. Not a violent crime. Not a murder in the usual sense. A gentle, self-chosen ending, hidden behind the appearance of natural causes far from home. And she had witnessed it, without knowing, at first, what she was seeing. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the soft crackle of the fire. There remained only to explain it, calmly, kindly, without disturbing the peace Mr. Hale had so carefully arranged. Chapter 6. Quiet Explanation. The afternoon light had softened to a gentle grey by the time Miss Marple decided the moment had come. She did not telephone ahead. Telephones, she always felt, carried a certain urgency that this matter did not require. Instead, she put on her second-best coat once more, tucked the small notebook into her handbag beside the 2 ticket halves and the folded copy she had made in her own neat hand of the signal box note, and walked the short distance to the Blue Boar Inn. A Lionel Enderby was sitting in the small residence lounge when she arrived. A low fire burned in the grate. A single lamp cast a warm circle on the table where he had spread his papers. He rose at once when he saw her, surprise giving way quickly to courteous welcome. Miss Marple, this is unexpected, but most welcome. Please, do sit. May I order tea? Thank you, Mr. Enderby. Tea would be very pleasant. While the maid was fetching the tray, Miss Marple settled herself in the opposite armchair. She waited until the door had closed behind the girl before speaking. I believe I now understand what happened to Mr. Hale, she said quietly. And I thought you should hear it before the inquest. It is not a matter for the coroner's court in any formal sense. It is simply a matter of human understanding. Mr. Enderby leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on his knees. I'm listening. Miss Marple opened her handbag and placed the items on the table one by one. First, the return ticket stub she had found beneath the signal box, then the matching half from Mr. Hale's pocket, which Mr. Enderby had brought with him. then the copy of the note from the signal box. She did not touch the original note Mr. Enderby already possessed. She merely referred to it. Mr. Hale was not taken suddenly, and without warning at Market Basing Station, she began. He chose his ending with great care and deliberation. He chose it here, in St. Mary Mead, at the very moment he stepped aboard the 3:47 train. She paused while the tea arrived. The maid set down the tray, poured 2 cups, and withdrew without a word. Miss Marple added a little milk to hers, stirred once, and continued in the same calm, unmeasured tone. When I saw him on the platform that afternoon, everything appeared ordinary. He bought a return ticket. He carried a suitcase. He spoke politely. Yet there were small signs, tiny, almost invisible, that something was different. His hand trembled when he reached for the carriage door. He looked back along the platform, not once but twice, as though taking a final leave of the place he had come to call home. And most telling of all, he left the suitcase behind. Mr. Enderby nodded slowly. We have already noted the lightness of the case. Precisely. An almost empty suitcase is not the luggage of a man intending a day's errands and a return journey. It is the luggage of a man who wishes to create the appearance of return, while knowing he will never need the contents again. Inside were only the folded coat, the timetable, and the note you showed me. Forgive me. The train must leave on time. A gentle apology to the world, and a reminder to himself that the moment had come. She lifted the 2 ticket halves and placed them side by side so the perforations aligned perfectly. This ticket was whole when he bought it. He used one half to board the train here. The other half, by rights, should have remained in his pocket until he returned. Yet one half was found beneath the old signal box the very next morning. How? Mr. Enderby waited. Mr. Hale placed it there himself, Miss Marple continued. Not as he boarded. That would have been too hurried, too noticeable. He placed it there earlier, perhaps the evening before, or even earlier still. He knew the signal box was unused, dusty, forgotten. He may have had a way to open the window latch years ago, or simply slipped the paper through a crack in the frame. He left it inside, where no casual passerby would find it, but where someone who looked carefully, someone who already suspected something was not quite right, might discover it in time. She set the ticket halves down again. Now consider the journey itself. The train takes 35 minutes to Market Basing. Mr. Hale sat in the rear carriage, alone, or nearly so, at that hour. He had prepared what he needed, a small dose of a peaceful sedative, perhaps morphine or a strong barbiturate, something a man with a known heart condition might legitimately possess for pain. He took it shortly after departure, when the train was moving steadily and the countryside was slipping past the window. He closed his eyes. He waited. By the time the train slowed for Market Basing, he was beyond waking. Mr. Enderby drew a slow breath. The porter helped him down. Yes, thinking him merely asleep or unwell. Mr. Hale was carried from the carriage, set on the platform bench, took a few instinctive steps toward the exit. And there he lay down forever. The local doctor saw only a sudden cardiac arrest in a man of advancing years. No struggle, no signs of violence, natural causes, exactly as he intended. A log settled in the fire with a soft crackle. The suitcase, Miss Marple went on, was left behind to complete the picture of an ordinary day trip, interrupted by tragedy. If he had taken it with him and died with it in the carriage, questions might have arisen about why a day traveler carried so little. By leaving it here, forgotten, light, yet containing only the note, he ensured the focus remained on the sudden death far away, not on any private despair at home. Mr. Enderby looked down at the copied note from the signal box. And this? A final safeguard. He left it where it might be found after he was gone. By the porter, perhaps, or by someone else who wondered why a suitcase had been abandoned. It explains everything without accusation. He took the draft in the carriage. By market basing, he would be gone. No one need know the reason. The train would carry him away from the village, away from any shame or reopening of old matters. She folded her hands in her lap. I made a few quiet inquiries through my nephew Raymond, who has contacts in London. Mr. Hale was once an accountant of good standing. Years ago, there was an error, not dishonesty, no, but a serious oversight that cost a client a considerable sum. The matter was settled privately, but the shame remained with him. Recently, quite by chance, old correspondence resurfaced. A distant relative of the client wrote to the firm that now holds the records, asking if anything further could be done. Mr. Hale learned of it. He could not bear the thought of public disgrace returning in his later years. So he chose a different path, one that left no scandal, no inquest into motive, no burden on the village. Mr. Enderby sat back, his expression grave but not shocked. You believe he committed suicide? In the gentlest sense of the word, Miss Marple replied. Not an act of despair alone, but an act of control. He decided the manner and the place and the appearance of his going. He wished to spare others pain, and he wished the story to end quietly. An elderly gentleman collapses on a station platform, far from home, heart failure, peaceful, final. She looked into the fire for a moment. That is why the title of this small story feels so exact. There was a death at the train station. I witnessed it, though I did not recognize it at the time. And it was, in a way, a crime. Not against the law of the land, but against the natural wish most of us have to live a little longer. Yet it was his crime, his choice, carried out with such care and dignity that one can only feel compassion. Mr. Enderby was silent for a long time. At last he spoke. What would you have me do? Nothing dramatic, Miss Marple said softly. The inquest will record death by natural causes, and that is true enough in the eyes of medicine. The note in the suitcase can remain private, and the one in the signal box. Perhaps you might ask Tom Wilkins to burn it quietly, without ceremony. The village need never know more than they already do. A kind, reserved gentleman met an unexpected end while traveling. Order is preserved. Peace remains. Mr. Enderby gathered the papers slowly. You have shown me a great kindness, Miss Marple, and a great clarity. She rose. It is only what any of us might wish for ourselves, to be understood, at the last, without judgment. He saw her to the door of the inn. The evening had grown cool. Stars were beginning to appear above the rooftops. Thank you, he said again. Miss Marple smiled her small, gentle smile. Good night, Mr. Enderby. She walked home along the quiet lane, the frost once more forming on the hedgerows. The lights of her cottage glowed softly ahead. Inside, she lit the lamp. He drew the curtains and sat for a while by the fire without moving. The explanation was complete. Now there remained only the resolution. Chapter 7. Peaceful Resolution. The inquest was held on a quiet Tuesday morning in Market Basing, in a small room above the town hall that smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. Miss Marple did not attend. There was no need. Mr. Enderby had telephoned the evening before to confirm that everything would proceed exactly as the coroner had indicated. Death by natural causes, cardiac failure, no suspicious circumstances. The brief medical evidence, the porter's simple statement, the absence of any complicating factors, all combined to produce the expected verdict. The matter was recorded, filed, and closed with the gentle finality of a book shut after the last page. Instant, a merry Mead. The news arrived by the usual channels, a mention in the weekly paper, a few words exchanged over the counter at the post office, a sympathetic nod from Dr. Haydock when he passed Miss Marple in the lane. No one spoke of scandal or mystery. Mr. Reginald Hale had been a reserved gentleman, newly settled in the village, who had met with an unfortunate end while travelling. That was all. The house by the mill stood empty now. The furniture was removed in a single van one grey afternoon. The key was returned to the landlord. Within a week, the curtains were drawn back, and a small for rent sign appeared in the window. Life moved forward, as it always did, in small, unhurried steps. Miss Marple spent the days that followed in the familiar rhythm of her own household. She finished the second sock for Mrs. and Bantry, and delivered the pair with a pot of quince jelly wrapped in checked muslin. She pruned the last of the autumn roses, tying their stems carefully against the coming winter winds. She baked a plain seed cake and carried slices to old Mrs. Sims, who had taken a chill. In the evenings, she sat by the fire with her knitting basket, working on a soft shawl in pale lavender wool, the needles clicking in the same soothing cadence that had accompanied her thoughts through the entire affair. One afternoon, perhaps 10 days after the inquest, Tom Wilkins called at the cottage. He stood on the doorstep, cap in hand, looking a little awkward but determined. "Miss Marple," he began, "I thought you'd like to know. I did as Mr. Enderby asked. The note from the signal box. I burned it yesterday evening, in the brazier behind the goods yard. No one saw. Just a few scraps of paper and some old envelopes. Gone in a minute." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Thank you, Tom. That was kind of you." He shifted his weight. "I read it first, though, just to be sure. It was peaceful, wasn't it? The way he wrote it. Like he didn't want to cause any trouble." "Yes," she said. He did not. Tom nodded, replaced his cap, and touched the brim before turning away down the path. She watched him go until he disappeared around the bend, then closed the door softly against the chill. That evening, she invited Mr. Enderby to tea before he returned to London. He arrived punctually at 4, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. They sat in the sitting room, the fire burning bright, the curtains drawn against the early dusk. "I leave tomorrow," he told her after the first cup. "The last of the papers are signed. The few small bequests Mr. Hale left, to a charity for retired clerks and a sum to the village church restoration fund, have been arranged. There is nothing more to do." Miss Marple inclined her head. He would have been glad of that. Orderly to the end. Mr. Enderby set his cup down. "I have thought a great deal about what you told me. About choice. About dignity. I confess I had not considered such matters in quite that light before. One reads of sudden deaths in the papers and thinks only of the medical cause. But there is always more beneath the surface. Human reasons, private sorrows. Always," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "Yet most often, they are not for us to judge. Only to understand, if we can." He opened the parcel and drew out a small, leather-bound volume, a pocket edition of Wordsworth's poems, slightly worn at the edges. "He kept this in his coat pocket," Mr. Enderby explained. "The police returned it with the other effects. I thought, perhaps you might like to have it. A small remembrance." He marked one passage. Miss Marple opened the book to the folded page. The lines were underlined in faint pencil. "Thanks to the human heart by which we live, thanks to its tenderness, its joys and fears, to me the meanest flower that blows can give thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears." She closed the book gently and placed it on the small table beside her chair. "Thank you, Mr. Enderby. I shall treasure it." They spoke for a little while longer, of the village, of the changing seasons, of small things that mattered in their quiet way. When he rose to leave, and the sky outside was fully dark, stars sharp above the garden wall. At the door he paused. "You have given me peace in this matter, Miss Marple, more than I expected." "And you have helped preserve his?" she replied. "That is enough." He bowed slightly and stepped into the night. Miss Marple returned to her chair. She did not pick up her knitting at once. Instead, she sat looking into the fire, the small book resting in her lap. The flames danced steadily, casting soft shadows across the room. Outside, the village settled into its evening hush. Lamps glowed behind curtained windows. A dog barked once in the distance. The church clock chimed the quarter hour, its notes clear and unhurried. Everything was as it should be. The mystery that had begun with an ordinary afternoon at the station had ended not in revelation or drama, but in quiet acceptance. Mr. Hale's death at the train station, witnessed, understood, and gently set aside, had been restored to the order he had so carefully arranged. No scandal had touched the village. No shadow lingered over the platform or the lane or the house by the mill. The trains continued to arrive and depart at their appointed times, carrying passengers forward into whatever awaited them. Miss Marple rose at last, turned down the lamp, and carried the Wordsworth volume to the small shelf beside her bed. She placed it between her well-read copy of The Imitation of Christ and a slim collection of Jane Austen's letters. It fitted there perfectly. She drew the curtains, smoothed the counterpane, and slipped beneath the blankets. The room was warm, the fire banked low for the night. Outside, a frost was forming again on the window panes, tracing delicate patterns in the moonlight. She closed her eyes. The pattern was complete. Death at the train station had been exactly what the title described, a quiet, chosen moment, witnessed by one who understood the human heart just enough to let it rest in peace. All was well. The little station at St. Mary Mead stood waiting for tomorrow's trains, its clock ticking steadily through the dark hours, carrying time gently forward. Sleep well, dear listener. The story is finished. The world is quiet now. Good night. Chapter 8. The soft echo of Winter Winter came to St. Mary Mead earlier than usual that year. By the middle of December, the lanes were rimed with frost each morning, the hedgerows brittle and silvered, and the air so still that every sound carried farther than it should. The creak of a gate, the distant clatter of a milk churn being set down, the slow toll of the church bell calling the faithful to evensong. Miss Jane Marple welcomed the cold. It sharpened the mind without hurrying the body, and it gave one an excellent excuse to keep the fire burning low and steady from breakfast until bedtime. She had taken to walking to the station once or twice a week. Not every day now, for the path was slippery in places, and her sensible boots, though excellent, were no longer quite so sure-footed as they had been 30 years earlier. But on clear mornings, when the sun was pale and low, and the sky the color of new milk, she still made the short journey. She carried no knitting on these expeditions, and instead she tucked her hands into the deep pockets of her winter coat and let her thoughts drift as slowly as the vapor from her breath. The platform had changed very little. The same wooden bench stood beneath the same old clock. The same signal arm, now fully automatic, stood straight and patient. Tom Wilkins had been promoted to senior porter the previous month. He wore his new badge with quiet pride and still swept the platform with the same long, deliberate strokes. When he saw Miss Marple, he always touched his cap and offered a small comment about the weather. "Sharp again today, miss." "Very sharp, Tom, but the air is clean." He would nod, satisfied with the exchange, and return to his work. One such morning, shortly before Christmas, a Miss Marple arrived to find the platform empty, except for a single figure standing near the rear edge. The place where Mr. Hale had paused at the carriage door all those weeks before. The stranger was a woman of about 50, neatly but plainly dressed in a dark coat and hat, carrying a small leather handbag and nothing else. She was looking down the line towards the cutting, exactly as Mr. Hale had done. Miss Marple did not approach at once. She settled herself on the bench as usual, opened the small volume of Wordsworth Mr. Enderby had given her, and pretended to read. Yet her eyes, sharp behind the calm surface, followed the woman's every small movement. The stranger turned once, glanced along the platform toward the ticket office, then back toward the village lane. The gesture was so familiar that Miss Marple felt the faintest stir beneath her ribs. Not alarm, not even surprise, only recognition. The woman's hand rose briefly to the collar of her coat, as though to steady something inside herself. Then she walked slowly towards the rear of the platform and stood looking at the spot where the brown suitcase had rested. Presently, the 10:42 to Market Basing whistled in the distance. The woman straightened. She bought no ticket. She carried no luggage. She simply waited until the train slowed, the doors opened, and a handful of passengers stepped down. Then, without haste, she boarded the rear carriage, the same one Mr. Hale had chosen, and disappeared inside. Miss Marple closed the book. The train pulled away, steam drifted across the platform like grey lace. Tom Wilkins swept on, unperturbed. Miss Marple remained seated a little longer. She did not feel the need to follow or inquire. Some things, she knew, were best left to complete themselves in silence. Later that afternoon, she received a short letter, postmarked Market Basing, addressed in a careful feminine hand she had never seen before. "Dear Miss Marple, I believe you were acquainted with my brother, Reginald Hale. He spoke of you once, in passing, said there was an elderly lady at the station who noticed everything and judged nothing. I came today to see the place where he last stood in this village. I did not wish to disturb anyone. I only wished to say goodbye in the way he would have understood." He left a second letter with his solicitor, to be opened after the inquest. In it, he asked that no one be troubled on his account. He also asked that a small sum be sent anonymously each Christmas to the Church Restoration Fund here, so that something good might continue quietly after him. I have carried out his wish, and now I have carried out mine. Thank you for the kindness you showed him. Even unknowingly, yours sincerely, Eleanor M. Hale. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the small drawer of her bureau, where she kept a few other private papers, a postcard from Raymond in Rome, a pressed violet from her sister's garden many years ago. The ticket stubs she had never quite been able to discard. She did not reply. There was no need. The woman had come, had stood where her brother had stood, had boarded the train and gone away again. The circle was closed. That evening, Miss Marple lit the lamp early. She drew the curtains against the dark, set a small kettle to boil, and took the Wordsworth volume from its place on the shelf. She opened it at the marked page and read the underlined lines once more, slowly, letting each word settle like snow. Thanks to the human heart by which we live. Outside, the first flakes of the season began to fall, soft, silent, covering the lane, the garden wall, the roof of the cottage in a thin white veil. The trains would run through the night, their whistles faint and far between. The station clock would tick on, measuring hours that no longer carried any burden of mystery. Miss Marple closed the book. She poured tea into a favorite cup, added milk, stirred once. All was quiet. The death at the train station had been witnessed, understood, and at last released. What remained was only the gentle turning of seasons, the small kindnesses that pass between strangers, the peace that comes when every question has found its answer. Not in noise or revelation, but in the simple acceptance of what is human. She sipped her tea. The fire crackled softly. The snow continued to fall, and somewhere, far down the line, a train moved steadily through the winter dark, carrying its passengers toward whatever morning awaited them. Sleep well, dear listener. The story rests now. All is calm. Chapter 9. Lantern Light. In early spring. Spring arrived in St. Mary Mead with the kind of modesty that suited the village best. No sudden blaze of color, no dramatic thaw, just a slow, patient unfurling. By late March, the snowdrops had given way to pale primroses along the churchyard wall, and the forsythia beside Miss Marple's gate was showing its first yellow stars, and the air carried the faint, sweet promise of damp earth and new growth. The days lengthened gently. Twilight no longer hurried in at the tea time. Miss Marple noticed these changes the way she noticed most things, without comment, but with quiet appreciation. She had taken up a new piece of knitting, a simple cardigan in soft heather wool, intended as a late birthday gift for Cherry's mother, and found that the longer evenings gave her more time to sit by the open window, with the lamp turned low, listening to the blackbirds that had returned to the garden. One such evening, as the light was turning the color of old honey, a small envelope arrived by the second post. It bore no stamp, hand-delivered, the writing on the front familiar, yet not immediately recognizable. On inside was a single sheet of cream notepaper and a pressed violet, its color still vivid after months between pages. Dear Miss Marple, I hope this finds you well. I returned to the house by the mill last week to collect the last of my brother's books that the landlord had kindly stored. While sorting through them, I found this violet pressed inside his Wordsworth, between the very pages he had marked. I believe he placed it there himself, perhaps on the morning he left for the last time. I could not bring myself to disturb it then. Now it seems right that it should come to you. He would have wanted someone who understood quiet things to have it. Eleanor Hale. Miss Marple held the violet to the lamplight. The petals were delicate, almost translucent at the edges. She laid it carefully on the small table beside her chair, and beside the pocket edition of Wordsworth that had rested there since Christmas. For a long moment, she sat without moving, letting the small gift settle into the room like another breath of spring. The next morning, she walked to the station again. The path was dry now. No more need for caution on the gravel. Tom Wilkins was waiting at the platform gate, sweeping as always, but he paused when he saw her coming. "Morning, miss. Fine day for it." "Very fine, Tom. I thought I might sit a while." He nodded, understanding without needing more words, and carried on with his broom. Miss Marple took her usual bench. No knitting today, just her hands folded in her lap, the small violet tucked between the pages of the book she carried in her coat pocket. The 9:35 to Market Basing was due soon, and already she could hear its distant whistle threading through the trees. A few passengers gathered. Mrs. Price with her string bag, now fuller with early rhubarb from her garden. Young Jimmy from the post office, carrying a parcel for the afternoon van. An elderly couple she did not recognize, visitors perhaps, speaking softly to each other about train times. None of them paid particular attention to the far end of the platform, to the old signal box that stood silent and sun-warmed, its paint flaking in gentle curls. Yet Miss Marple looked toward it. The window was cleaner now. Tom must have wiped it sometime in the winter months. Through the glass, she could see the outline of the lever frame, the shelf, the place where the second note had lain. Nothing remained there now. The paper had been burned, the moment released. But the box itself seemed to hold the memory quietly, the way an old house holds the echo of footsteps long after the walkers have gone. The train arrived with its familiar sigh of brakes. Doors opened and closed. Voices murmured farewells. The elderly couple boarded together, helping one another up the step. Mrs. Price waved to someone on the platform. Jimmy handed his parcel to the guard. And then, almost as an afterthought, the train gave a gentle jerk and began to move. Miss Marple watched it go. Smoke rose in soft plumes, drifted across the cutting, dissolved into the blue. When the last carriage had vanished, she remained seated a little longer, letting the platform empty itself around her. Presently, Tom came over, leaning on his broom. "Anything the matter, miss?" "No, Tom. Nothing at all the matter." He looked toward the signal box, and then back at her. "Funny how quiet it stays, even when the trains come and go." "Yes," she agreed. "Very quiet." She rose slowly, smoothing her coat. "Thank you for keeping the place so tidy, Tom. It matters more than people realize." He touched his cap. "Just doing my job, miss." She smiled her small, gentle smile and started the walk home. Along the lane, the primroses were opening wider now. A thrush sang from the top of an elm. Somewhere a child laughed, perhaps the new family who had taken the house 2 doors down from the mill. Life continued in its small, persistent way, stitching itself back together after every parting. When Miss Marple reached her gate, she paused to pick a single spray of forsythia, bright against the dark green of the hedge. And inside the cottage, she placed it in a plain glass jar on the windowsill, beside the violet and the Wordsworth. The 3 things looked well together: flower, petal, poem. A small memorial that needed no explanation. That afternoon, she finished the first sleeve of the cardigan. In the evening, she lit the lamp early, drew the curtains, and sat reading. Not Wordsworth this time, but a favorite trollop she had not opened in years. The story moved slowly, comfortably, full of recognizable human failings and small redemptions. Outside, the spring night deepened. Stars appeared one by one above the garden. A train whistle sounded far off, perhaps the late service from Market Basing returning to the village. The sound came softly, carried on the cool air, then faded again. Miss Marple closed the book. She rose, turned down the lamp, and went upstairs. In her bedroom, she placed the pressed violet between the pages of the Wordsworth once more, closed the cover gently, and set the book on the night table. The room was quiet. The house was quiet. The village was quiet. And somewhere along the line, the trains kept their steady rhythm, arriving, departing, carrying people toward whatever small portion of life remained for them. Death at the train station had long since become part of the past. The witnessing had been gentle, the understanding had been kind, the resolution had been complete. Now there was only the ordinary turning of days, the soft echo of seasons, the lantern light of memory burning low and steady. Miss Marple drew back the curtain for a moment, looked out at the starry dark, then let it fall again. She slipped beneath the blankets. Sleep came easily. Good night, dear listener. The trains are running on time. All continues peacefully. Chapter 10. The last whistle of summer. Summer returned to St. Mary Mead, in the way it always did, slowly at first, then all at once. By mid-July, the lanes were lined with tall grasses gone to seed. The air hummed with bees working the lavender borders, and the sun stayed high, long enough that tea could be taken in the garden without a cardigan. Miss Jane Marple had reached the age when she no longer minded the heat. She simply moved more slowly through it, choosing shade where she could find it, and never hurrying for hurry's sake. Her cottage windows stood wide most afternoons, letting in the scent of warm earth and cut hay from the fields beyond the village. The heather cardigan she had finished in spring now belonged to Cherry's mother, who wore it proudly to market every Saturday. In its place, Miss Marple had begun a light summer shawl, fine cotton thread in pale cream, delicate enough to drape over shoulders on cooler evenings without weighing them down. One particularly still afternoon, she decided to walk to the station again. The path felt shorter in summer. The hedgerows had grown so thick they brushed her sleeves on either side. She carried only a small basket containing a linen napkin, a slice of sponge cake wrapped in greaseproof paper, and the Wordsworth volume, now slightly more worn at the spine from frequent opening. The platform was drowsy when she arrived. The midday train had come and gone. The next one was not due for nearly an hour. Tom Wilkins sat on an upturned crate near the ticket office, fanning himself with an old timetable. And when he saw her, he stood at once. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Hot one." "Very warm, Tom. But the breeze off the cutting makes it bearable." He offered her the crate. She declined with a small smile and took her usual bench instead. The wood was sun-hot beneath her palms. She unfolded the napkin, broke off a piece of cake, and ate it slowly, watching the shadows of leaves move across the rails. After a time, she rose and walked to the far end of the platform. The old signal box stood unchanged, paint more faded now, window glass still reasonably clean. She did not try the door. The padlock remained firmly in place. Instead, she simply stood before it, letting her gaze rest on the place beneath the window, where the ticket stub had once lain, where the second note had waited. Nothing stirred there now, or only a single butterfly, pale yellow with black spots, settled briefly on the wooden frame, wings opening and closing in the heat, then lifted away toward the wild roses that had begun to climb the far side of the box. Miss Marple turned back toward the bench. As she did so, she noticed something small and white caught in the grass at the platform edge. A scrap of paper, no larger than a bus ticket. She bent carefully, retrieved it, and smoothed it between her fingers. It was a corner torn from a larger sheet. On it, in faint pencil, were just two words, "All well." The handwriting was not Mr. Hale's. It was smaller, rounder, perhaps a woman's, perhaps Eleanor's, perhaps someone else's entirely. The paper was old, edges browned, as though it had lain there through at least one winter and one spring. She held it a moment longer, but then let it drift from her fingers back into the grass. The breeze took it at once, carrying it a few feet along the platform before it lodged against a sleeper. Miss Marple returned to the bench and sat again. Presently the whistle sounded, two short blasts, one long. The 412 from Market Basing rounded the bend, smoke curling lazily upward in the still air. Doors opened. A handful of passengers stepped down. A young mother with a toddler on her hip, an elderly man with a walking stick and a folded newspaper, two schoolgirls carrying satchels and laughing about something that had happened in class. Last to alight was a woman in late middle age, dressed in light summer gray, a simple straw hat shading her face. She carried no bag, only a small bunch of white daisies tied with raffia. She paused at the bottom of the carriage step, looked along the platform toward the signal box, then toward the village lane. For a heartbeat, her gaze passed over Miss Marple. Without recognition, without pause, then she walked quietly to the far end. She stood before the signal box exactly as her brother had once stood before the carriage door. She laid the daisies carefully on the wooden step leading up to the door. 3 white flowers, a single yellow center each. No note, no ribbon, nothing else. Then she turned, walked back along the platform, and boarded the return train that was already waiting on the opposite track. The guard blew his whistle. The engine gave a gentle cough. The carriages began to move. Miss Marple watched until the last coach disappeared into the cutting. The platform emptied again. Tom Wilkins came over, wiping his brow. "See that lady, miss? Left flowers? Odd place for them." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said softly, "the odd places are the right ones." He nodded, accepting the answer without question, and returned to his duties. Miss Marple remained seated until the sun had dropped lower and the heat began to ease. Then she rose, smoothed her skirt, and started the walk home. Along the lane, the air smelled of honeysuckle and ripening blackberries. A swallow darted low across the path. Somewhere, a lawnmower started to life, then settled into a steady drone. When she reached the cottage, she set the basket on the kitchen table, unwrapped the remaining cake, and cut herself a thin slice. She carried it outside to the garden bench beneath the apple tree, along with the Wordsworth and a fresh cup of tea. She opened the book, not to the marked page this time, but to the very end, in where the flyleaf bore a small, neat inscription in Reginald Hale's hand, to be read slowly, in quiet places. She smiled faintly, closed the cover again, and simply sat. The shawl lay half-finished on the garden table beside her. She picked it up, found her place, and began once more to work the delicate stitches. The cotton thread moved smoothly between her fingers, light as summer itself. High above, a train whistle sounded. Distant now, almost part of the background hum of the afternoon. It came, it passed, it faded. All well. The words drifted through her mind like the scrap of paper on the platform, small, unclaimed, yet somehow complete. Death at the train station had become in time only one more story among many that the village carried quietly within itself. Witnessed long ago, understood with compassion, resolved without fanfare. In what lingered now was not sorrow or puzzle, but the soft echo of human care. A bunch of daisies on a forgotten step, A violet pressed between pages, 2 words left on the wind. Miss Marple lifted her face to the late sun. The shawl grew longer, stitch by stitch. Somewhere along the line, the trains kept their rhythm, steady, unhurried, carrying their passengers forward into whatever golden hour awaited them. The garden was quiet, the village was quiet, and the summer afternoon stretched on, gentle and complete. Sleep well tonight, dear listener. The trains are still running. Everything continues in its